Hello, class. Welcome to your lecture on Chapter 14. This chapter deals with supply chain design. The learning objectives, at least from the standpoint of what we're doing in this chapter, will be conceptual. So there are several places in the chapter where there are problems and there are some calculations. We'll jump over those. Instead, we're going to describe strategic options for supply chain design and look at some strategies to make supply chains more effective. Thinking about factors that influence decisions about outsourcing or even potentially insourcing and offshoring. Continuing to the next slide, we would want to think a little bit about how we deal with disruptions and risk in supply chains. We'll talk about the bullwhip effect. And we'll look at a very current topic, which deals with blockchains and cloud computing technologies that could favorably influence our visibility and ability to work with partners in supply chains. When we look at supply chains, I was talking about learning objectives about improving or getting better results. And so we need to think about financial measures that are influenced by supply chain decisions. And among those, some of the keys are how much revenue a firm gets, total revenue. We can have a huge influence on cost of goods sold. And that in turn frequently will drop right down to the bottom line. So, huge point of leverage in supply chain management. Operating expenses, cash flow, working capital, return on assets, all of those are influenced by supply chain design and also the way we manage a supply chain. And those are related. So if we can increase total revenue, increase sales by better customer service in our supply chain, we'll want to do that. If we can reduce costs, we'll want to do that. And if we can reduce the operating expenses, we'll want to do that. All of those things will have an immediate impact on the net income from our supply chain. Then the way we use money and inventory, the way assets are managed can influence, what we might say is the denominator in calculating financial ratios such as return on assets. So we can influence the numerator, the green boxes you see on this chart, and we can influence the denominator. We can influence both through effective supply chain management. When we look at supply chain management, we may see a parallel to what we talked about earlier in the course when we talked about operations. And you'll remember that it's typical for operations to either be flexible or to be efficient or low cost in their orientation in terms of their competitive priorities. We see something similar when we look at supply chains. The terminology we use is a little bit different. So we'll talk about decisions that make for efficient supply chains, and usually that comes from partners who are using make-to-stock operating strategies. And then we'll see some characteristics of responsive supply chains. And usually the partners in those sorts of supply chains are operating in a more flexible type of operation using assemble to order, make to order, or design to order strategies. The way it would look in a picture is what you see here with figure 14.3. If we're talking about the make to stock strategy being used by individual partners in the supply chain to create an overall efficient supply chain, then what you're going to see is basically we're forecasting demand. Usually, you could say one link in the chain at a time. So a component supplier is going to forecast demand from a manufacturer. The manufacturer is going to forecast demand from a uh, customer or potentially some distributor or some warehouse where we want to keep finished goods inventory in stock. And so, the downstream partners are ordering based on their own individual forecasts, and the upstream partners are supplying based on their, you could say, demand. When they get an order, they supply, but they've built to stock, so they're able to supply. So essentially, what we have here is a situation where we're going to have independent decisions which can lead to uh, places in the supply chain where there's a lot of stock, and maybe places in supply chain where there's less stock. And hopefully, we always have enough stock to keep the supply chain operating. And what we're trying to do is be efficient in our own piece of the supply chain, and overall, those economies of scale that we generate can lead to an efficient supply chain. That's the idea. Sometimes there may be imbalances in inventory across the chain. By contrast, if we're thinking about a more um, responsive supply chain, we're likely to have an assemble to order, design to order, maybe a make to order type strategy being used by the partners. And it'd look like this if we're talking about the assemble to order. This will give us an idea about what it's going to look like in the other scenarios too. So you'll notice that a customer gives an order and we assemble what it is that the customer wants. We use two things. We'll use things that we have to make that are unique to that customer's order, and we'll use parts that are standardized that we can use for that order. So if a customer's ordering a particular, let's say I want a custom golf cart, it may be that I want it to look very unique, but the internal powertrain and transmission and everything associated with that could be just something very much like any other golf cart. So what we're going to do is we're going to combine fabricated and standardized parts in responding to that customer's order. Whatever standardized can be used the way we saw in the efficient supply chain on the previous slide. So one of the things you'll see later in the chapter when we talk about it is when we talk about mass customization, we think about standardizing as much as possible and delaying or postponing is the word we prefer to use, the customization to the extent possible. And so the response time for an assembler doing an assemble to order thing is influenced by the amount of fabricated parts that are required. So to the extent we can utilize standardized parts, we're probably going to try to do that.
In Chapter 2, the first part of it, you saw the product process matrix, which you'll remember gave us the idea that job shops are these processes that are essentially flexible and process-oriented processes like job shops and small batches are good at things that product-oriented processes like a line flow, an assembly line, or a continuous flow process are not good at, and vice versa. So when we're thinking about supply chains, the same sort of consideration comes to view. So when we look at the literature on supply chain management, we find that there are supply chains which are really oriented more like the assembly lines and oriented to serving assembly lines and are geared toward creating efficiency in the supply chain. So obviously we refer to those as efficient supply chains. And then there are supply chains that are more oriented towards situations where the output is not so standardized and predictable, and we have to be a little bit adaptive or flexible in our orientation in order to respond to what needs to happen. So obviously, Then we refer to that sort of supply chain as a responsive supply chain. So typically you're going to see the similar competitive priorities to job shops when you're talking about responsive supply chains, and similar competitive priorities to assembly lines or continuous flow processes when you're thinking about efficient supply chains. So efficient supply chains typically produce a more standardized output that would have an optimized design that is utilized for an extended period of time, and new product introduction or product redesign would be a relatively infrequent thing. Only after thousands of units have been produced, maybe hundreds of thousands of units. And by contrast, a responsive supply chain might introduce new products or respond to customer requests, so that you might produce 10 or fewer, even in some instances, of whatever it is that you happen to be producing. So the margin per unit is going to be small in an efficient supply chain, but you're doing such volumes that you make lots of money and recover your large fixed costs with this low variety output. And by contrast, you'll have a high margin because you don't have lots of units with which to recover your costs in a responsive supply chain. So there's this concept that comes back to us that strategically we can't have a supply chain that's really effective on all performance criteria. Generally, we're going to target our supply chain toward efficiency or toward responsiveness. Some of the design features that go along with that targeting of our supply chain toward efficiency or responsiveness will have to do with how we do our operations planning in the supply chain. Generally, if we're thinking about efficient supply chains, we'll make to stock standardized products. We'll emphasize high volumes. We're more likely to be shipping in truckload full quantities or larger. And we're really focused on figuring out ways to generate economies of scale. By contrast, the responsive supply chain uses a lot of order-based planning. So either we'll assemble or make to order, or maybe even design to order. Our products are going to be customized, and what we're going to emphasize is our ability to provide a wide range of possible outputs based on customer preferences. We're going to potentially, in an efficient setting, try not to have excess capacity. In a responsive setting, excess capacity is very helpful so that we can provide customers with what they need when they need it, having no knowledge in advance of what that might be. Inventory is going to be relatively low. We might have a lot of pipeline inventory in an efficient supply chain, but we're not going to carry a lot of raw materials inventory, and we're going to do the best we can to create high inventory turns. Even this idea of lean that we'll talk about later in the semester is something that will seem quite appealing to us. By contrast, in responsive supply chains, we're going to buy inventory when we need it to deliver what it is that we need to deliver. And we may strategically stock various types of inventory that are useful for a wide range of possible outputs. So in terms of lead times, there's a couple of ways you could look at this. If people are buying stuff off the shelf, then shortening lead time isn't going to make the customer necessarily any more happy. But if we reduce a lead time, that means we can keep less inventory on the shelf, which makes us more efficient. So we look at lead time as a source of reduced inventory and more efficiency in an efficient supply chain. And by contrast, in a responsive supply chain, it's hard to say you're responsive to a customer who comes in and asks if they can have a particular product or service, and you say, well, sure, we can do that for you. We'd be able to get that done sometime in the next 3 years. No, that's silly. So responsive supply chain obviously needs to look at lead time and the length of time it takes to respond to a customer's order or request as something that is a competitive performance indicator. Finally, in supplier selection, efficient supply chains tend to emphasize the reliability of the supplier along with low prices. So we want a low price for what we're buying, but only in the sense that the supplier is reliable at that price. It doesn't do us a lot of good if we have a very large assembly operation to have one supplier that forgot to send something. Let's say the steering wheel supplier in an auto assembly operation. And look, if you don't get any steering wheels, then everything shuts down. So we really need consistent quality so that what comes in can be used immediately. And we want this thing to come in on time. And particularly, we would like for that to be done in an efficient, cost-efficient way. When we're thinking about a responsive supply chain, it's not such a repetitive sort of operation that's going on with our relationship to suppliers. We won't probably have a 1-year contract for the supply of a part like you might have, or even a 5-year contract like you might have with an efficient supplier. Instead, what we're probably going to have is we're going to have some knowledge of what our supplier's capabilities are. And what we'll want to talk to our suppliers about is not so much the price of the thing they're selling, but how well they can jump through the hoops that we happen to see as they arise. So we're going to emphasize the speed with which they're able to do that and the unique customized characteristics that they're able to add on any single given order, the variety flexibility and volume flexibility in their operation perhaps, or even the top quality. So this picture looks very much like the product process matrix that you saw back in chapter 2. So basically what we're saying is the responsive supply chains tend to be those that give us more customized products and tend to have a lot of job or small batch type operations associated with them, tend to operate in reasonably small volumes and smaller volumes certainly than efficient supply chains, and tend to be much more flexible. By contrast, the efficient supply chain is oriented to providing standardized products, and we'll see a lot of line flow or continuous flow type processes in that setting. We'll see a lot of make to stock in the efficient supply chain. We'll see a lot of make to order or design to order or assemble to order in the responsive supply chain. And so we'll end up with high volume, low cost per unit operation in the efficient supply chain. And we'll end up with a lower volume, higher cost per unit situation in the responsive supply chain, but also a lot of product variety, uniqueness, customization as possibilities. So one way to think about what type of supply chain you want to design would be to think about the relationship between the annual volume in the products that you sell and the weekly demand variability. So you might do a scatter plot. And if you find on your scatter plot that you have a large number of SKUs that you sell in high volumes and variability of demand is relatively limited, then you're a strong candidate for efficient supply chain in terms of the way that you design your relationships with customers. And probably if that's how things are, you're already doing things in the way that efficient supply chains would do things. Of course, if you have low volumes but a lot of variety, in terms of your weekly activities and demand, then you're probably behaving like a flexible supply chain and What you want to pursue is the strategies that you see in flexible supply chains. You might say, well, Dr. Hanna, I understand what you're saying about efficient supply chains. I understand what you're saying about responsive supply chains, but I just bought this Apple phone, and if we can even call it a phone today, but it didn't cost me so much. It was less than $1,000. And think about it, when you compare my phone to your phone, it's completely different. I've got all these apps that you never heard of, and you've got all those things that I don't care about on your device. And so, how is it that this thing, which is delivered efficiently, is also very customized to my personal needs? And so, what you're referring to is something that's referred to as mass customization. There are a lot of ways that you can do it. And what we described with the Apple phone is a situation where the customer is able to adapt the product after they buy it to their own personal preferences. And it's set up in such a way that that's easy to do. Other times, it might be that the producer is able to, because of their use of very flexible but programmable technologies, like we talked about earlier in the class, might be able to produce in reasonable volumes for reasonably low cost items that are actually very customized. And so if we can get to that sweet spot where we can produce something that's very customized for a low cost, the benefits of economies of scale that come with mass production, but customization that provides the customer with a unique value, then we have a really advantageous place for our supply chain from a competitive perspective. That's what we refer to as mass customization. It's a strategy whereby a firm's highly divergent processes are yet able to generate a wide variety of customized services and products at a reasonably low cost. So, we were talking about this in class one time. You see the pictures on this slide and you're thinking, what's that all about, Dr. Hanna? We were talking about mass customization, and a student wanted me to look up this website at this place where he had worked, and they customized these massive pickup trucks, F-650s. Turns out Shaquille had one, Wayne Huizenga, who at that time owned major sports clubs and Blockbuster Video, major companies had one, And so, they're massive and they're customized, but actually there aren't that many of them around, and they're pretty expensive. So, not really mass customization, but massive and customized, and pretty interesting. I don't know if you're like me, you like the eye candy looking at vehicles and stuff like that. And, you could search customized F-650 and you might enjoy seeing some of these things. I don't know. Kind of some cool vehicles, nothing that I would ever pay for. But if they could mass customize something like this, I might be interested, So anyway, mass customization. Let's talk about that just a little bit more. So obviously the advantage of mass customization is that we have, as a result of it, this innate and deep knowledge of our customers' preferences. We're able to produce things largely to order, so we don't have to worry about finished goods inventory. And the value of what we're delivering is perceived to be superior because of the customization. The way we get to it, some of the things that help us to get to that is, first of all, we'll use an assemble to order strategy. So, we'll make as much as we can that's standardized before the customization takes place. And that sort of goes along with this idea of postponement or channel assembly or customer value co creation, is the way the marketing people talk about it. So we'll do as much as we can using mass production methods and make to stock so that we maintain the efficiency in the supply chain to the extent that we possibly can, but then at the last possible moment, like after you've bought your iPhone, we will create the vehicle for customization and allow the customization to take place. One thing that's particularly helpful in this regard is if we create product designs that are modular, so we could build as many modules as possible as we might need to put in stock. And then when the final order comes in from the customer with very specific deliverables, then we use those modules, which have been produced very efficiently, to finally assemble what it is that takes place, what it is that the customer wants. Channel assembly is sometimes a strategy that's utilized in which we, for example, we might manufacture kits, and then the trucking company that delivers the product actually takes care of the assembly for the customer. And in that case, we've essentially postponed the customization until the very last moment, the moment of delivery.
Let's take a few slides and talk about design of supply chains in terms of the terminology we might use referring to how many channels are associated with the chain. So we might talk about supply chains being single channel, multi-channel, or omni-channel supply chains. Among the multi-channel supply chains, we might see direct to customer or direct store delivery type supply chains. And then among omni-channel supply chains, we might see customer-centric strategy, and we'll look at that a little more closely. Or we might see collaboration among partners or cross-channel inventory management. And essentially, what omni-channel refers to is the ability to fulfill orders from a wide variety of sources. So the first type that we described, the single channel supply chain, is the top picture here. And it's kind of clear if a customer's getting anything, then it's come through one particular set of supplying resources. So the retailer gets all of that particular item for that particular customer from the same distributor, and the distributor from the same producer. So it's kind of what it sounds like, single channel. If you've got a multi-channel supply chain, then you might supply a customer direct to customer from the producer. You might supply a customer through a distributor and a retailer, or there might be direct store delivery from the producer. So, for example, we might see something like, let's say Apple delivering direct to customer on the basis of web orders. We might see them delivering directly to a retailer, maybe even an Apple store, uh, maybe a Walmart, something like that, and delivering to the customer. Or we might see that they have some regional distributors. Let's say we're going to, I don't know, an Apple market in Brazil. I'm not 100% sure how things work in Brazil, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's a country distributor who supplies the retailers, and then the retailers obviously would satisfy the customers. So that would be a multi-channel sort of a supply chain. And frankly, as a customer, it probably doesn't matter to you which channel you get the supply from, as long as the characteristics of product and service are the same across all of those channels. This is a picture of a customer-centric omni-channel supply chain. Remember, there were other types, but basically, if we're talking about a customer-centric supply chain, then What we're talking about is the ability for the consumer to access the material or for the suppliers to deliver the material, regardless of their stage in the supply chain, directly to the consumer. So we got distributors going straight to consumers, retailers, producers, whatever. In an age of artificial intelligence and smart uh, uh, management systems, ERP systems, we could very easily see a situation where consumer indication of demand, some sort of information about I want this product or I need this service, could be the particular way in which that demand is met in a given hour, on a given day, in a given season, could vary at any point. And so we could have consumers getting material from any of a number of sources when they place their order in any particular way. And we could see materials at the same time being shipped and repositioned in the supply chain between producers, distributors, and retailers based on intelligence that's derived from other supply chain partners and even social media kinds of things. So an omni-channel supply chain, omni kind of being the term for uh, all or everywhere. And the idea in an omni-channel supply chain is that the information about demand is everywhere, and the material to satisfy demand is also everywhere. And when we match that demand and supply information, we can do it in the way that makes the most sense and is the most efficient.
Let's think a little bit more about some issues associated with designing the supply chain. This has a lot to do with the issue of what we're going to make and what we're going to buy. And so, we might be an organization that likes to buy a lot of what we sell to our customers. If that's the case, when we have a poor performing market, because we are controlling a relatively small portion of the value adding operations, we're not going to suffer as much as a company, let's say, that makes most of what they sell. So if you make most of what you sell and you hit a recession, then you've got the whole pain of the supply chain to suffer. Whereas if you're a small part of the supply chain and you're doing more of the controlling of buying and assembling, but not much making, then the pain gets shared across multiple supply chain entities. So outsourcing is the strategy that allows us to offload some of the risk and some of the coordination requirements and some of the knowledge oriented requirements associated with producing the value that goes into our product service bundle. You're very familiar with that term, outsourcing. It has huge political baggage associated with it, connotations, and politicians are always, they're always complaining about company outsourced this, company outsourced that, the jobs went to China. Well, if you outsource, the jobs might go to China, but if you outsource, the jobs might go across the street. So outsourcing in and of itself is not necessarily the transfer of jobs to another country. In fact, what you could do is you could sell a portion of your business to some other company and then outsource the production to that company, in which case it might be the same employees, the same facility, the same jobs, but you're not the company that's managing that process. And so you've outsourced the jobs. They're not on, and you've outsourced the operations. That those assets and those costs are no longer on your income statement and balance sheet. So it's a way to outsourcing is a way to restructure the way that you procure parts and knowledge in order to become less vested in those supply processes You obtain the benefits of the supplier's knowledge and capabilities, and you obtain the benefit of reduced exposure to business risk, or you could say shared exposure to business risk. Offshoring, of course, is what the politicians are griping about, and that's when we decide, okay, we're going to take these jobs that we were doing and operations that we were doing, let's say in Augusta, Georgia, and we're going to transfer those operations to a facility, let's say in, I don't know, pick a place, uh, Vietnam. So no longer are we in the same country. We may not have outsourced. So we could offshore and outsource at the same time, or we could offshore by building our own facility in the other country. So, this is what mostly politicians are complaining about when they gripe about outsourcing. Oh, they're taking the jobs overseas. Well, that is what's happening, and in large measure, that's happening in today's world because there are huge labor cost differences from one country to another. In fact, it turns out we used to think, well, we're going to China to get the advantage in terms of labor cost. And actually, nowadays, the cost of labor in China is substantially more than in some other South Asian countries. So, yeah, we're getting those benefits of labor advantage. In the process, we're incurring a logistical cost, but our logistical systems have gained such economies of scale. The size of the container shipping vessels has gone from something like several hundred containers to close to, if I'm not mistaken, 20,000 containers potentially on a single vessel. At least over 10,000 containers on a single vessel. So, what we're saying then is the economies of scale we have now in logistics enable us to take advantage of regional economic differences in the cost of production. And the result is that we have a lot more of logistical operations and perhaps a little bit less, maybe not on an absolute basis, but as a percentage basis, less local manufacturing of products that we consume. So, yeah, somehow we've got to think about outsourcing and offshoring when we're thinking about designing our supply chain. And we have to think perhaps about this issue of next shoring. And so next shoring sort of says, well, okay, we don't want to go to Asia with this particular product that we're making. We're going to look for example, because we have this U.S., Canada, Mexico trade agreement, we're going to look to stay within that trade bloc. Or because we're in the Eurozone, we're going to look to stay within that trade bloc. Or we're in the ASEAN nations, we're going to look to stay in that trade bloc. And so that will give us some advantages in terms of the coordination and paperwork and import-export restrictions and things like that. Also, it might be a little easier to communicate and interact and this sort of thing if it just involves a 2-hour flight to Mexico instead of, let's say, a 16-hour flight to Shanghai. So, well, maybe Shanghai, Singapore, Malaysia, whatever, maybe more than 16 hours. So, and we're on close to the same time zone, and there are a lot of reasons why it's easier to coordinate in that case. And a lot of times, the local or the more local suppliers might actually have a better understanding of our own environment, and they might be more in tune to the actual requirements that our customers have. And so we might be better able to more effectively use our supply chain when we do next shoring rather than offshoring. Of course, this outsourcing decision is closely related to strategic decisions that we make in a business. One of those is sometimes called vertical integration decisions. So, vertical integration involves buying a company that's a supplier or a customer, perhaps. So, if you think about the supply chain as moving from companies that are upstream in operations, tier one to tier two, tier three suppliers, to companies that are downstream in operations, uh, distributors, retailers, these sorts of companies. We could buy a supplier, in which case that company would become a part of our balance sheet. Their operations would be tied into our income statements, and we own them. They're a part of us. That's backward vertical integration. Uh, so, for example, if Ford buys the company that makes engines for them, Cummins, then they've obviously done some backward vertical integration. By contrast, if Ford buys a railroad that distributes their product, that would be forward vertical integration. So, yeah, those are approaches potentially that are related to this issue of either outsourcing or insourcing process. So we could integrate or we could sell a company and we could reverse the integration process. This is closely related to the make or buy decision. You can do a make or buy decision without buying the company. So, Ford might actually be buying the injection molded dashboard from a plastics company. They have no interest in buying the plastics company. They don't want to backward vertically integrate. However, they do want to bring the injection molding in-house so that there's much easier coordination and better control of quality, and it's potentially more efficient for them, and it's not such a complex process that they need the knowledge and know-how of their supplier. And so, they might just choose to make the product instead of buying it. Or at the same time, they might be injection molding the dashboards, or maybe they're making the radios, the sound systems that go in their vehicles. They might say, you know what, we really don't have the know-how to really be state of the art in terms of what we're doing here. And it's the first thing customers see or think about when they take a look at our product, is whether the dashboard looks cheap or looks well made, and whether the sound system seems to be premium. And so, what we're going to do in order to not have to maintain the knowledge, in order to gain the benefits of truly leading company in that particular area, what we're going to do is we're going to outsource that process. So we're not going to make the dashboard anymore. We're not going to make the radio anymore. Another company will make the dashboard, and maybe both will make the radio. So that's the make or buy. They're similar, vertical integration versus make or buy, but a little bit different in terms of the way that they are implemented. Of course, there are a lot of factors that go into these decisions to make or buy, to integrate vertically, to outsource, to offshore, and so on. So a large number of the factors, or some of the common factors, are listed on this slide. It might be based on labor, it might be based on consistent product quality, costs of logistics. We've referred to some of these things, to the tariffs and taxes that are faced, customer perceptions, labor laws, things of this nature. But we can actually make mistakes in outsourcing. Um, your book lists three here. One is listed as pulling the plug too quickly, or you could say uh, pulling the trigger too quickly another way. So, sometimes we just get really frustrated with our own internal challenges, and we think by outsourcing that somebody else will have the headaches. So, yeah, sure enough, somebody else does have the headaches, but you've got a new set of headaches in coordinating with that company, and the effects of it may be even detrimental in the long run. So, just getting rid of the headache doesn't necessarily get rid of the problems. Technology transfer is a huge risk, especially where we're outsourcing and offshoring at the same time. Protections for intellectual property, protections for business knowledge are not the same in other countries as they are in our country. So if we outsource and offshore production of a part, and we provide our new supplier with the technology to do what we were doing, then pretty soon they're going to copy what we knew, and that can be a significant business risk associated with this outsourcing issue. And so that's something that companies need to be very careful and open-eyed about. Another potential pitfall is that oftentimes it's difficult to actually get a supplier to march in sync with your organization and your needs in the way that your own internal uh, process was marching in sync. So if the process is inside your company, then you have a lot of control over the way things are done to manage that process, and you can make things work together in a synchronous and a symbiotic way. Whereas a external supplier may have 20 different customers that they're trying to satisfy, and they may be less willing, potentially even less able to integrate their process with yours. So I think the bottom line here, we've skipped a good bit of this chapter, but we focused on this idea that what we need to do when we're designing supply chains is we need to think about this alignment of our internal operations with those of customers and suppliers, and ensure that we have effective alignment in order to create a supply chain that's going to be either efficient or that's going to be responsive. And there are a number of different levers that we can pull while we try and go about that, relating to outsourcing, offshoring, vertical integration backwards or reverse vertical integration, forward vertical integration, that sort of thing too. And then finally, that there are a number of opportunities in designing a supply chain to potentially gain opportunities to gain advantages related to creating a product service bundle that has some mass customization associated with it. So that's a quick look at the design of supply chains, a large bit of a terminology here. Hope you've enjoyed thinking about these things with me, and we'll see you on the next lecture. One of the most talked about supply chain topics is actually the bullwhip effect. And it's a really fascinating phenomenon that we see in, as far as I can tell, essentially every supply chain. And this is where ordering patterns increase, let's say variability in demand increases as you move upstream in the chain. So ordering patterns experience increasing variance as you proceed upstream in the chain, is the way the slide says it. Another way to think about that is if demand is relatively stable, but there's some variation in it at the consumer level, then the supplier will experience more variation, the supplier's supplier even more, supplier even more, and so on as you proceed upstream. That's why we call it the bullwhip effect. I don't know if you ever played crack the whip as a kid, or if you've ever actually cracked a whip, maybe a towel, who knows. But the small movement from your hand or wherever the source of variation comes from leads to rapid and significant movement somewhere far removed in a connected process. And I've heard that the sound you hear when a whip cracks is actually the end of the whip breaking the sound barrier. I don't know if that's true or not, but it makes a little bit of sense to me anyway. We could think of it this way. This is a picture of multi-stage or multi-echelon supply chain. And in my way of thinking, it's sort of drawn backwards, but that's all right. We can think about it the way that it's drawn. So it's showing the upstream suppliers to the right. Usually I would see things moving from left to right the way that I read. And so in this case, they're showing the amplification of the variance moving from left to right, even though the supply chain here is moving from suppliers on the right to consumers on the left. So, what happens is consumers' daily demand for a product is relatively stable. I mean, if you think about, this is describing facial tissue, and you would expect that in terms of the amount of facial tissue used in an area served by a given retailer, that the daily usage would be more or less constant. First illustration of this that I ever saw had to do with use of diapers. And you would hope, you would really, really hope that use of diapers day by day is pretty much constant in a given locale. And so with that relatively stable usage rate, consumers don't actually buy facial tissue, or they don't actually buy diapers in quite such a stable way. So we buy a box of diapers and we use that for a while. And probably the rate at which a retailer actually sells diapers wouldn't be quite as stable. Probably more people shop on the weekends, probably more people shop at a payday or something of that nature. So obviously then the retailer is probably not going to just replace in their purchase orders what they sell day by day. Instead, they're going to think about transportation costs and so on. We've had some discussion of lot sizing in this class already, and they want to balance holding and ordering costs. And so a retailer is probably going to place orders for facial tissue or diapers or whatever else in batches that are substantially greater than the variation that they see on a daily basis. So you're starting to see the amplification take place. And eventually manufacturers are going to have to satisfy these retailer orders. And if you make facial tissue with a variety of different characteristics, maybe some that has, an aloe softener infused in it, maybe some that's in different size and different packaging. And so what the manufacturers are going to be doing is probably making this stuff to stock and making large quantities all at once and putting it out there into the warehouse. And so eventually someone has to supply paper pulp And the people that make paper pulp are obviously going to have huge production runs because they're going to be using probably something like a continuous flow process. And the what we're going to see then essentially is this amplification of demand variance as it moves backward through the supply chain. Has huge implications. If we could reduce the variation in orders to the manufacturer, then the manufacturer might be able to produce in smaller lots, ship in smaller lots. We might have a much more lean supply chain, a supply chain that's much more efficient. You guys remember that in certain settings we're really pushing for efficiency in our supply chain. And so the bullwhip effect is one thing we can work to reduce in order to create a more efficient supply chain. At the same time, if we reduce the bullwhip effect, we could be more responsive because, if we're in a position where we have a lot of inventory that we just made in a large batch, we've got to use that inventory before we can respond to a change in customer preferences. So whether we're talking about an efficient or a responsive supply chain, this is a important effect that we seek to combat through more effective supply chain coordination. A lot of what this chapter deals with really is how we make decisions about utilizing our supply chain. So we're talking about business processes, or you could say decision-making processes. And some of those that we'll talk about, one has to do with the supplier relationship process. You might say, oh, that's just buying stuff. Well, I suppose you could approach it that way, but that's not really a supply chain coordination effort if that's how you approach it. So by creating a relationship with a supplier, you seek to more effectively integrate your processes, your purchasing processes with the supplier's delivery processes, and you may be able to have a more efficient or a more responsive, coordinated supply chain. So we'll look a little bit about what's involved in a supplier relationship process as we move through the slides for this chapter. Another process is the new service or the new product development process. A lot of times you say, well, you just design it and then you buy the parts. Well, that might be a way to do it, but if I'm designing a car and a car has a radio in it, it might be better to involve the radio producers in the design process. They may have some ideas that make the sound system better in terms of the materials that are being used in the cabin, or maybe in terms of certain shapes that sound will bounce off of in the cabin, or where the speakers might be placed, and so on. Then there's this order fulfillment process, which has to do with in the ongoing operation of the supply chain, how do we transact or exchange goods? There's a customer relationship process, which you could say is the mirror to the supplier relationship process. You would hope that those processes, in some way, between one tier and another of the supply chain, are really reflective of what's happening on the other side. So that's in large measure what we're looking at as we look at the rest of this chapter. We'll be thinking about these processes that are used to coordinate what's happening across a supply chain. One tool that's particularly helpful to us in many instances in order to coordinate supply chains and understand where it's working well and where it's not working well is the SCORE model. Now, I've adapted this picture a little bit from what you'll see in your textbook. I think there was maybe just a production error. I suspect the authors had it more like this, but in the textbook, the return arrow went from deliver to make, which is not really what a return is. So, SCORE stands for Supply Chain Operating Reference. It's a model, it's a modeling language that can be used across a supply chain. If all of the companies use this modeling language, then we can tie together their models into one score model that reflects the entire supply chain. So, what happens inside a company if we're modeling their supply chain operations using the score model is we actually have 5 different supply chain activities. One supply chain activity is source, one is make, one is deliver, another is return, and the final is plan. So actually, plan talks about how we make decisions to support sourcing, manufacturing, or delivery, or even return. There are 2 different types of returns. One type of return would be a source return. That's when we buy something. That's what's at the left side of this model. That's when we buy something and it turns out we didn't need it or it wasn't to the quality standard that we required or whatever, and we have to send that back to someone else. So that's a source return. And then there's this thing called a delivery return. A delivery return occurs when our customer says, you know, what you sent us isn't what we needed, we're sending it back, and we have to figure out then how to put that back into our own inventory and what we're going to do with it, or maybe dispose of it, whatever it is we need to do. And also give the customer the appropriate credit, whatever that might be. So, essentially, a supply chain, if we're thinking about it from the score model perspective, is a combination of different companies making similar decisions. And if we see that the way that we're making decisions doesn't match the way the customer is making decisions, or if we see that the way we're sourcing doesn't match the way that we're making, or the way we're making doesn't match the way we're delivering, or the way we're planning for these doesn't match, then that's an obvious point at which we can improve the coordination of our supply chain. So, for example, we might make things to order, but we might deliver things to stock. Or we might make things to stock and deliver things to order. And so those are situations where it's very obvious, using the score modeling approach, that there's a potential for improvement of the coordination. So this is one tool that we might see used when we're thinking about these processes that we're about to talk about, moving through the rest of the chapter.
Let's change gears. We'll talk about supply chain risk management for a few minutes. In a way, this relates to what we've been talking about with the bullwhip effect, but basically, this is much broader than that. So, supply chain risk management is our attempt to administer the risk of any factor or address the risk of any factor or event that could disrupt our supply chain, whether that's a single firm that experiences the disruption, like a fire in a facility or a strike among workers, or something that might impact the supply chain across multiple firms, such as tariffs, which have been big in 2025, or a government shutdown, which has been big toward the end, was big toward the end of 2025. You know, these are things, or even a potentially a uh, disruption like the uh, Suez Canal and the Houthi rebels sort of resulting in rerouting of freight through the Red Sea. So, you know, these sorts of things could be across multiple firms. Obviously, if we've identified risks, we're interested in reducing the risks that we see in our supply chain. There are a variety of ways to do that. And to tell you the truth, we probably aren't going to try and reduce every risk. I mean, there are some that'll be more important to us and get more of our attention than others. And so probably we're going to prioritize among the risks that we've identified. And those that are most important, we'll try to create a strategy to remove or reduce the risk. Of course, if we cannot reduce or remove the risk, then we'll want to also have a strategy to identify what we could do to minimize the impact if that disruption or problem arose and have a response plan. Anyway, things we can do to reduce risk. Strategic alignment would say, let's get on the same page with our suppliers. That way, when they're acting in their own interest, they're acting in ours. Integrate more effectively upstream or downstream, which is to say, our operations fit in terms of scale and capacity and decision-making timing and things of that nature, communication more effectively. Visibility. If we can see that our supplier has completed an order and placed that in finished goods inventory, if we can see that it's been shipped, if we can see that the ship, if we're talking about a transcontinental shipment, has arrived in port, all of these things would enable us to uh, reduce the risk that we're facing because we know what we're dealing with in terms of supply timing. Being more flexible enables us to reduce risk. If we're disrupted in one area of an operation and we're flexible, then we can respond to that by using capacity and capabilities in another area. Redundancy simply means, for example, if I have the chance of strike at a facility and there's another facility where I can make the same product, then I've reduced the risk associated with that. So redundancy is a backup system. Short replenishment lead times, always if we can do things in a shorter time frame where our exposure to risk is shorter, which is also consistent with producing in smaller lot sizes, finding a way to effectively use supplies when things run short. You see this sometimes, when there's a natural disaster. So, if there's a natural disaster and power is out, people don't have refrigerators in their homes, a hurricane or something of that nature, it's pretty common for example, the retailers that are selling ice to say, no, you can only have one bag. Or, for example, when during COVID there was a short supply of toilet paper, you can only have one package when you go to the store to buy it. This is a way to uh, enable our customers to have across the board their demand met despite the disruption that we saw. Everyday low pricing, like we talked about with the bullwhip effect, can reduce variability in demand and reduce our operational risk. And obviously, the ability to cooperate and trust suppliers and downstream distributors and retailers, those are things that would reduce our operational risk. And we could probably keep going with this list. One particular type of risk is a security risk. And so, we especially in supply chains want to be cognizant of the fact that there are bad actors. There are uh, individuals, organizations, crime syndicates, whatever, that might choose to benefit themselves from the supply chain that we're attempting to manage. So we want to keep those types of actors away from our supply chain, have effective access control to information and physical security to keep materials secure and to keep bad actors out. Uh, Shipping and receiving policies are huge in this area. And so we want to make sure that the way we hand off and receive materials That's a point of vulnerability, and we want to make sure that those are hardened and secure aspects of the supply chain. Transportation service providers are a big part of security in the supply chain. And there's actually an ISO certification we could get to, uh, in the process of getting it, we would be strengthening the security of our supply chain. And so if we want to have the gold standard for our customers, for our suppliers, we might seek that certification under ISO 28000 for supply chain security. This kind of says the same thing pictorially as the last couple of slides. So basically, we're saying that there are risks across the entire supply chain, and so we need security across our supply chain, whether it's overseas suppliers, whether it's inside a manufacturer, whether it's in a distribution center, whether it's in cargo terminals, and everything that's in between. So obviously, there there's no place where we want to be lax about security in a supply chain. So this is kind of the last topic in the chapter, cloud computing and blockchains. Cloud computing is the practice of using, as you know, non-local server, so remote servers hosted on the internet to manage and process data. Obviously, this allows us to share data and information across our supply chain in a pretty simple way. If we had stuff stored on a local hard drive or on a intranet inside our organization, then it's more difficult to share that information. So that's pretty useful as long as we can keep it secure aspect of managing supply chains today. Blockchains we use across a group of supply chain partners if they're completely trusted. So if we use the blockchain technology, perhaps with crypto type currency, we can digitally create a digital chain that keeps track of all the transactions associated with uh, individual partners in a supply chain. So the transactions are blocks and they're linked together in a list that we'd call a chain. And essentially, that's the financial, the ability to use crypto to manage the finances of a supply chain. And in a way, we get around a lot of the friction, financial friction that takes some of the financial efficiency out of a supply chain with this. There's some governments and partners that don't like this because, it can be used to, uh, how shall we say, it can be used to hide what you're doing from government or regulator type entities that might need to have visibility into a supply chain. So there are a few more slides to reinforce what I said on the last one, a couple with cloud computing and a couple on blockchain. So as I said, essentially cloud computing enables every participant to have, uh, this says the right information at the right place at the right time. Another, maybe better way to say that would be to have the same information at all times. And so it enables supply chain coordination that we might see in a variety of ways. One is transaction integration. So everybody's using the cloud and that's the same transaction. There aren't 3 or 20 different records of the transaction. Management information is the same. So there may be coordination of the management information and there may be the ability to collaborate strategically as a result of the sharing of management information. This is a picture Makes a lot of sense. Material is flowing across the supply chain, but instead of the information just flowing back across the supply chain, back and forth across the supply chain, the information's going to the cloud and everybody sees everything at the same time. So cloud computing makes a lot of sense to more effectively communicate and coordinate across a range of partners in a supply chain.